America didn't just build highways, it erased neighborhoods, displaced millions, and carved cities apart. Entire communities vanished under concrete and interchanges. And yet, this same system turned the United States into a logistical superpower. The highways that destroyed American cities also built the economy that dominates the world today. This is the story of how one infrastructure project did both at the same time. In the years following World War I, American automobile manufacturers rapidly shifted away from wartime production and back to building cars for civilians. As factories retooled, vehicle ownership surged across the country. In just a short span, the number of cars on American roads multiplied several times over what it had been before the war. Families who had never owned a vehicle suddenly had one parked outside their homes, fundamentally changing how distance, work, and daily life were experienced. Commuting patterns expanded, rural isolation began to shrink, and expectations about personal mobility rose faster than the nation's ability to support them. But the country wasn't ready for this transformation. Nearly 90% of America's roads were still unpaved, little more than dirt paths shaped by wagon wheels and weather. Rain could turn them into mud, heat into dust, and winter into impassable barriers. Cars broke down, shipments stalled, and entire regions remained isolated despite the explosion in mobility. The nation had cars, but it lacked the infrastructure to support them at scale, creating a growing mismatch between economic potential and physical reality. That gap triggered the first federal response. In 1916, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act, offering some of the earliest national funding for road construction. It was a recognition that roads were no longer a purely local concern, but part of a growing national system. For the first time, Washington acknowledged that fragmented infrastructure limited national growth. Still, the money was limited, and the scope was small. What the act produced were incremental improvements, not a system capable of supporting a modern, interconnected economy. The limits of that approach became obvious in rural America. In Iowa, a local highway commissioner named Thomas Macdonald had seen the consequences firsthand. Growing up, he watched farmers struggle to move their goods, crops spoiled before reaching market because roads were unreliable or impassable, turning production into loss. Entire harvests could become worthless simply because transportation failed. For Macdonald, roads weren't convenience projects. They were economic lifelines tied directly to survival. Those experiences shaped his ambition. Macdonald didn't just want smoother surfaces or straighter routes, he became fixated on connectivity. Roads, in his view, had to link regions, states, and markets into a single functioning network. Only then could people and products move freely across the country, and only then could local economies escape isolation and volatility. What no one fully understood yet was who would pay the price for that network. That philosophy followed him to Washington. In 1919, Macdonald was appointed chief of the Federal Bureau of Public Roads. From that position, he pushed a radical idea for the time, a truly national highway system designed around long-distance travel and uniform standards. This wasn't just about building roads, but about imposing consistency, widths, grades, signage across an entire continent. States alone, he argued, could never afford to build it or coordinate it effectively. Federal investment was essential. His proposal rested on a simple premise: shared funding for shared growth. Macdonald framed highways as an investment, not an expense. A 50-50 partnership between states and the federal government, he believed, would unlock long-term economic expansion by lowering transportation costs and stabilizing supply chains. Goods would move faster, markets would widen, and inefficiencies caused by geography would shrink. But the question remained unanswered. Where would such a system begin, and how could it survive political resistance from states wary of federal control? That uncertainty lingered until the country plunged into crisis. By 1938, the United States was deep in the Great Depression. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was deploying sweeping federal programs to revive a stalled economy. Unemployment was rampant, industrial output had collapsed, and confidence in the system itself was eroding. Large-scale public works became a central tool of recovery, not just economically, but psychologically. Road construction fit that strategy perfectly. Building highways meant immediate jobs, visible progress, and long-term utility. It absorbed labor quickly and spread investment across regions rather than concentrating it in financial centers. For Roosevelt, roads were a way to inject money directly into the economy while leaving behind lasting infrastructure. For Macdonald, it was the opening he had waited decades for. After years of stalled momentum, he seized the opportunity. He presented Roosevelt with a vision he had been refining for 20 years, not just a few transcontinental routes, but a system that reached every state. Highways that made it possible to drive anywhere from any point without leaving a unified network governed by national standards, binding the country together physically as well as economically. Roosevelt approved funding for a first test. $25 million were allocated to build a 160-mile highway straight through the Appalachian Mountains. The project wasn't chosen for ease, it was chosen for difficulty. Steep grades, unstable geology, and harsh weather made it a proving ground. If this could work under the harshest conditions, Macdonald's national vision would gain credibility far beyond a single region. Years before the war, Eisenhower had already experienced the limits of American roads firsthand. In 1919, as a young Army officer, he took part in a military convoy sent across the country to test whether U.S. roads could support large-scale troop movements. The journey took weeks longer than expected. Vehicles broke down, bridges failed, and entire stretches were barely passable. The lesson stayed with him. A nation that couldn't move quickly, couldn't defend itself, or project power at scale. That test unfolded as global events underscored the value of mobility. In Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower was seeing modern highways in action. The German Autobahn demonstrated what high-capacity roads could do for speed, logistics, and coordination, advantages that became decisive during the Second World War and reshaped military planning. The contrast with American infrastructure was impossible to ignore. After D-Day, those lessons became unavoidable. Eisenhower watched as armies used roads strategically, converting highways into one-way corridors, pushing forces eastward. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, and speed often determined success. When Allied troops crossed the Rhine and reached the Autobahn, they moved faster than retreating German forces on their own infrastructure. Roads weren't just transport corridors. They were strategic assets that could decide entire campaigns. When the war ended in 1945, the United States emerged as a global superpower. Eisenhower's career advanced alongside that transformation. He served as Army Chief of Staff, then as the first Supreme Commander of NATO, operating within a new global security architecture shaped by mobility, logistics, and rapid deployment. By 1952, he won the presidency in a landslide. With Eisenhower in the White House, highways became a national priority. Macdonald's long-held dream finally aligned with political power and military logic. The interstate system was now framed not just as economic infrastructure, but as a matter of national security. But Eisenhower wanted new leadership to execute it. He replaced Macdonald with his former protege, Frank Turner, signaling a shift from vision to implementation. Turner's appointment marked a shift from advocacy to execution. The task ahead was massive. Designing and building a national interstate system required unprecedented engineering coordination, standardized construction methods, and long-term financial planning across decades. Turner brought the technical focus and administrative discipline needed to turn decades of planning into concrete and steel, often under intense political pressure. By the late 1960s, progress was visible but incomplete. Only 25,000 of the proposed 40,000 miles of interstate had been built. Costs had ballooned as projects encountered urban density, political resistance, and complex terrain. Turner's highway budget had nearly doubled from its original 1956 estimate. The system was over budget and behind schedule, testing public patience. Despite that resistance, its effects were already reshaping the country. Cities connected to the interstate network grew rapidly as goods, labor, and capital moved more freely. Manufacturing and distribution clustered around exits and corridors. Places that had once been regional hubs became sprawling metropolitan centers. Albuquerque, Dallas, and Phoenix expanded dramatically. Between 1950 and 1970, Denver doubled in population. Houston tripled. Phoenix grew tenfold, reshaping the balance of economic power across regions. While eastern cities reaped early benefits, the western United States remained a challenge. Turner faced pressure to complete a direct route through the Rocky Mountains, a barrier that still fragmented the national system. Without it, the promise of a truly coast-to-coast network remained incomplete. He bet on an ambitious solution, a massive drilling machine known as the Shield to carve a tunnel for Interstate 70. The gamble failed. After advancing only 70 feet, the machine became stuck. The weight of the mountain above made progress impossible, exposing the limits of scale alone. Technology alone couldn't overpower geology. If the route was going to exist, engineers had to adapt. There was no alternative path. The solution was the multiple drift technique. Engineers drilled a main tunnel surrounded by smaller drift holes, reinforcing the surrounding rock with concrete. This layered structure redistributed pressure and reduced the risk of collapse. It was slower and more complex, but it worked where brute force had failed, demonstrating the adaptability required to complete the system. Using this method, crews successfully bored a 2-mile tunnel through the Rockies. When it opened in 1973, the Eisenhower Memorial Tunnel became the highest highway tunnel in the world. For the first time, the western side of the country was fully integrated into the interstate system, closing a critical geographic gap. That connection unlocked development. Tourism expanded, ski resorts flourished, regions once isolated by terrain became economically accessible, drawing investment and migration. Supply chains shortened, seasonal economies stabilized, and land values shifted. After completing this milestone, Turner retired. But construction continued. As the network grew, its costs became clearer. Congress kept funding highways, but the economic benefits were unevenly distributed. In cities, interstate routes often cut directly through established neighborhoods, prioritizing speed and efficiency over community continuity. Planning decisions favored traffic flow over social impact. Many of those communities were predominantly African American or low income. Homes were demolished. Social networks built over decades were erased almost overnight. Churches, businesses, and cultural centers disappeared beneath interchanges. Families were displaced with limited compensation and few alternatives. What had been framed as progress came at the expense of people with the least political power to resist it. The highways that fueled national growth also entrenched inequality at the local level. Looking back, the legacy is conflicted. The interstate system was something the country needed to function at scale in a global economy, but it was built on terms that excluded many Americans from its benefits. Entire communities paid the price for a project designed to benefit the nation as a whole. Despite that cost, the economic impact is undeniable. The United States would not have developed into the world's leading economy without making this choice. The system was finally completed in 1995, nearly 30 years late and $100 billion over budget, reflecting both its ambition and its complexity. By the time the system was complete, the damage was already permanent, and so was the power it created. What remained was a standardized national network, 47,000 miles of highway, 55,000 bridges, a unified system of signage and construction stretching from coast to coast. It reshaped where Americans lived, how they worked, and how goods moved, embedding mobility into everyday life and national identity. Long after the pavement erodes, the imprint of that decision will remain. Future archaeologists may find little trace of the asphalt itself, but the system it created, the movement, the scale, the economic reach, will define how the 20th century United States is understood. The Interstate Highway System didn't just connect America, it divided it, and in doing so, it turned the nation into a superpower.